Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Mason Hale reached the canyon near mid-afternoon, the sun hitting the stone walls in a way that made the air feel hotter than the open plains behind him. He had been riding since sunrise, stopping only once to check the worn leather straps on his saddle and to give his mare, Bramble, a short rest. His work as a horse trader often kept him moving between scattered settlements. But this trip had a different weight behind it. He was on his way to deliver two mares to a rancher north of the canyon, hoping the payment would cover the feed and supplies he needed for the next few months. Money was always tight, and he tried to avoid staying in one town long enough for anyone to ask about his past. His past never left him, even when no one asked. Years earlier, he had worked with a scout group that patrolled disputed regions along the frontier. One choice he made during a tense night raid resulted in deaths he still replayed in his mind. Since then, he kept to quiet work, stayed away from crowds, and avoided situations that required trust. The canyon, with its narrow paths and stretches of silence, suited him. He preferred land that kept its distance. He guided Bramble toward the small waterfall he knew from previous travels. Water collected in a shaded pool at the bottom, providing one of the few reliable drinking spots in this barren region. As they approached, Mason slowed his pace, scanning the ground automatically for fresh sign, tracks, disturbed sand, anything to suggest he wasn't alone. He saw nothing unusual, so he dismounted. The air near the water felt cooler. He loosened the bridle so Bramble could drink freely. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his glove, relieved to rest for a few minutes before pushing on. As he knelt to refill his canteen, a faint sound reached him. It wasn't the fall of water or the shifting of his mare's hooves. It was a breath short, tight, and uneven, like someone trying to steady themselves. Mason froze. His instincts sharpened at once. He had survived too many close encounters during his years as a scout to ignore something so small. He didn't reach for his gun, but let his hand rest near the holster, ready if he needed it. He stood slowly and turned his head only enough to check the edges of the canyon. Nothing moved in the open. The sound had come from behind the falling water. He kept his voice calm and controlled. "Someone there?" For several seconds, there was no answer. Then a woman spoke, her words strained but deliberate. "Don't look at me. Please. I need help." The tone hit him harder than the request itself. She wasn't hiding to ambush him. She was hiding because she didn't want to be seen. Mason stepped back from the water to show he wasn't approaching. "Tell me what you need." "My clothing was taken by the current," she said. "I have nothing to cover myself with." He understood immediately. Without speaking further, he unbuckled his long coat and walked to a flat rock near the pool, placing it there gently. He kept his eyes downward, making sure she heard the distance between his steps. "The coat's here. Take your time." He returned to Bramble's side, ensuring he wasn't blocking her path if she needed space to emerge. Behind the waterfall, movement stirred. The figure stepped out slowly, keeping most of her body angled away. The coat wrapped around her frame, her hands gripping the fabric with a tense, protective hold. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with long black hair hanging wet against her back and shoulders. Her breathing was controlled but shaky. Mason didn't lift his eyes higher than her face. Even that felt like more attention than she wanted. He noticed the exhaustion in her expression and the strain in her posture, as if she had run far before reaching this place. She adjusted the coat once more before speaking. "My name is Asha." "Mason Hale," he said. "You hurt anywhere?" She hesitated before answering. "My foot. I hit a rock when I jumped from the path above." "Let me see from where you're standing," he said, keeping distance. She shifted her weight, extending her leg slightly so he could assess her without stepping closer. Her ankle showed a visible bruise, swollen around the bone. "You'll walk slower, but you can still walk," he said. Asha nodded. Her eyes flicked toward the canyon entrance, checking for movement. "They chased me into here." "Who?" Mason asked quietly. "Raiders," she said. "I don't know how many, but they scatter my group. I ran until I couldn't hear them anymore." Mason evaluated the canyon walls, listening for any echo that didn't belong. He didn't hear pursuit, but he also knew riders could move silently when they wanted to. The possibility of danger changed his priorities. His delivery job could wait. Keeping her alive couldn't. "I know a shelter not far from here," he said. "Old Hunter's place. We'll get you out of the open." Asha studied him carefully, trying to determine if trusting him was a mistake. Mason could read the conflict in her face. She needed protection, but she also understood the risk of depending on a stranger. "You can walk ahead of me," he offered. "I'll stay back. You choose the pace." She took a slow breath and finally nodded. "All right." They moved out from the pool area, her steps cautious, his steady and silent. Asha checked behind her several times, not because she feared him, but because her body hadn't settled from the panic of being chased. Mason didn't comment or rush her. He matched her speed without drawing attention to the bruised ankle slowing her down. The canyon shifted into narrower bends, and the sound of the waterfall faded behind them. Mason noticed the way Asha tightened the coat with each gust of wind, and the way her shoulders gradually relaxed when nothing threatened them for several minutes. He watched her without staring, alert to danger but aware of her discomfort. She had dignity even in this vulnerable state, holding herself upright despite the cold water and the weight of fear she hadn't released yet. "Why were you traveling through here?" Mason asked, keeping his tone neutral. "My family was moving camps," she said quietly. "We tried to avoid conflict areas, but danger found us anyway." He didn't press further. Her voice carried enough truth to tell him she wasn't hiding anything harmful. As they walked, Mason's mind worked through the situation. He hadn't planned to take anyone with him. He avoided responsibility whenever possible. But leaving her alone in a canyon after a raid wasn't something he could justify. He made a decision without saying it aloud. He would ensure her safety, no matter how far off course it took him. Asha slowed as the land leveled out ahead. She pointed weakly toward a rise of stone barely visible through scattered brush. "Is that the shelter?" "Yes," he said. "Almost there." She exhaled, the first sign of relief she'd shown. Mason noticed it, understood it, and walked beside her in silence, both of them aware that the world behind them had shifted the moment she stepped out from behind that waterfall. The farther they moved from the waterfall, the more the sounds of dripping water faded, replaced by the dry scrape of sand under their boots and the low rustle of wind pulling across the canyon walls. Asha kept her weight on the uninjured side, trying not to limp openly, though Mason noticed each time her steps shortened or her breath tightened. He didn't speak about it. Drawing attention to pain often made it worse, and she was already holding herself together with sheer focus. Mason stayed a few paces behind her, close enough that she wouldn't feel unprotected, but far enough to avoid crowding her. He knew how easily someone could feel trapped when their freedom had just been taken from them. His years with the Scouts had taught him that survival wasn't always about physical strength. It was about giving a frightened person room to breathe. Asha glanced back every few minutes, checking that he hadn't stopped or drifted away. Each time she looked, she found him walking with the same steady rhythm. His attention split evenly between her movements and the canyon around them. She realized slowly that he wasn't guarding her. He was watching for threats she might not see. They reached a bend where the canyon floor widened into a shallow basin dotted with scrub. Mason paused, signaling her to rest without speaking. She lowered herself onto a flat rock, pulling the coat over her legs. Her wet hair clung to the fabric, cooling her quickly. She wrapped her arms around her middle and held herself still, trying to calm the shaking that came from adrenaline wearing off. Mason stopped a few feet away, letting her settle before he spoke. "How long were you running?" "Since morning," she said, her voice tired. "I thought I could outrun them, but the canyon turned me around. When I reached the water, I didn't know where else to go." "Anyone else from your group make it out?" he asked. She shook her head. "I don't know. The raid happened fast. I lost sight of everyone when the fire started." Mason felt a familiar pull in his chest. Recognition. He remembered the countless times he'd watched innocent people scatter in terror while soldiers or raiders tore through camps. He wasn't proud of the role he'd played back then. The memory added weight to this moment, pushing him to stay with her rather than finish his delivery job alone. Asha studied him as he scanned the canyon walls. "You listen to everything," she said quietly. "Habit," he replied. "It keeps me alive." Her gaze lingered on him, measuring whether he was being truthful. She saw no sign of exaggeration or pride, only a man who had learned caution through experience. When she rose again, her steps were stiffer. Mason adjusted his pace so she wouldn't feel the pressure to move faster. He didn't comment when she stopped to steady herself against the stone wall, but he moved slightly ahead, offering shade with his presence while she caught her breath. "Why are you traveling alone?" she asked, wiping a bead of water from her forehead. "Work," he said. "Trades, deliveries. Keeps me fed, keeps me moving." Moving from what? He didn't answer immediately. He watched the horizon through the narrow opening of the canyon. "From things I don't want following me," he finally said. She accepted that without pushing further, understanding the tone more than the explanation. The land began to slope upward, signaling they were nearing the shelter he had mentioned. Asha hesitated before climbing a short rise, the uneven footing challenging her bruised ankle. Mason stepped beside her, not to take her arm, but to give her balance if she chose to use him. She didn't hold on, but she stayed close enough that his support was there if needed. At the top of the rise, the old hunter's shelter came into view, half hidden by brush, small, and worn from years of weather. Its slanted roof sagged toward the right, and a narrow entrance sat just wide enough for one person to slip through. Smoke stains along the stones proved someone had used it once, but the place now looked untouched. Asha stared at it with a mixture of relief and hesitation. "No one is inside?" "I checked it last season when I passed through," Mason said. "Empty then." "Probably still empty." She let out a slow breath. "It's better than being out here." Mason nodded and moved toward the shelter with caution, approaching from the side rather than walking straight in. Asha watched him move, noticing the way his body shifted into alertness, shoulders slightly tensed, steps silent, hand near but not on his weapon. She saw then that this wasn't just a traveler. He had been trained for danger. He stepped through the entrance first, scanning every corner. Only when he was fully certain did he turn to her and give a short nod. "Safe." Asha walked inside, pulling the coat tighter around her. The air was dry and still, and the shade inside the shelter gave her a stronger sense of security than the open canyon ever could. She leaned against the stone wall and inhaled slowly, allowing her mind to settle after the long escape. Mason waited a moment near the doorway, watching her reaction before stepping aside. He didn't ask her to sit or move or explain anything else. She had already revealed more fear in one afternoon than she likely had in months, and he wasn't going to push her any further. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyes focused on the floor. "For stopping. For not walking away." He studied her for a breath. Her voice carried exhaustion, but also strength, an unwillingness to break even when stripped of everything. "I wasn't going to leave you in that canyon," he said simply. Asha lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes for the first time with steady clarity. "Good," she said, "because I don't think I could have made it out alone." Mason didn't smile or make light of it. He only nodded once, accepting the truth without judgment. The sun dipped lower outside, casting long shadows through the broken slats of the roof. Inside the shelter, Asha drew her knees up beneath the coat, keeping herself warm. Mason stood near the entrance, listening to the canyon for any sound that didn't belong. Both of them understood, without saying it, that their lives had shifted directions the moment she whispered for help behind the waterfall. The inside of the shelter held a faint smell of old smoke and dry earth, the kind of scent that lingered after years without use. The walls, made from stacked stone and rough-hewn logs, trapped the last traces of daylight, leaving the interior dim but not completely dark. Asha stepped further inside, keeping the coat wrapped tightly around her body as water dripped from the ends of her hair onto the cracked dirt floor. Mason set his saddlebags down near the entrance, choosing a place where he could see both the doorway and most of the room. It wasn't habit, it was survival instinct he could never fully turn off. He removed a small bundle of brush from one of the bags and crouched near the old fire pit, testing the remains of charred wood left behind by whoever had used the shelter before them. Some pieces were still dry enough to catch flame. Asha watched him work, studying the slow, methodical way he arranged the sticks. She noticed how controlled his breathing stayed, how precise his movements were. He didn't rush, and he didn't make unnecessary noise. "You've done this many times," she said softly. "More than I wanted to," he replied. She sat on a low ledge built into the back wall, pulling her knees closer to conserve warmth. The coat shielded her, but the cold from the wet fabric beneath it made her shiver. She rubbed her arms briskly, trying to warm them. Mason saw the tremor and shifted the fire bundle closer to the pit. "It'll warm up fast once this gets going," he said, striking a match. The flame caught quickly, sending a faint glow across the floor. The flicker illuminated Asha's features, tired eyes, tense jaw, and a guarded expression that didn't soften even when she thanked him. Mason added thicker pieces of wood, building the fire slowly. Once he was satisfied, he sat a short distance away, giving her space to settle. The fire filled the shelter with a low crackle, smoothing the raw edges of silence. Asha let out a breath that seemed to ease some of the pressure inside her. She wasn't comfortable yet, but she wasn't on the verge of collapse anymore. She pressed the side of her foot against the stone wall to test her balance, wincing at the ache radiating from her ankle. "Does it hurt badly?" Mason asked. "It's manageable," she answered. "I've walked with worse." Her words carried the weight of someone who had learned endurance out of necessity rather than choice. "You'll need to rest it tonight," he said. "Pushing it might make it worse." She didn't argue. After several moments, she spoke again, voice steadier but still wary. "Why were you alone out here?" Mason shifted his gaze to the fire. "I was taking horses north. That's the job. Keeps me away from places I don't want to revisit." "What places?" He paused, deciding how much to reveal. He didn't owe her an explanation, but something about her quiet, direct curiosity made him answer. "Old fort towns. Camps where I worked. Too many memories there." She studied him, noticing the faint grimness in his expression. "People you lost?" "Yes," he said, his tone flat. "People I should have protected." Asha didn't press him for details. She knew what it felt like to lose someone and still feel the blame long after the danger passed. The silence between them shifted, no longer tense, but shared in understanding. Outside, wind brushed against the canyon, sending a faint whistle through gaps in the wood. Asha pulled the coat tighter, her shoulders rising as she absorbed the sound. She hadn't felt safe for days, maybe weeks, and the change between running through dusted ravines and sitting by a fire with another human being felt almost unreal. Mason noticed her scanning the corners of a shelter. "No one's coming in tonight," he said. "I checked for tracks on the way here. Ground behind us was clean." Her jaw loosened slightly. "Thank you for looking." He nodded once, acknowledging her trust without responding verbally. Asha shifted into a more comfortable position, letting the fire warm the stone behind her. She kept her eyes on the flames, speaking in a quiet, steady tone. "When the raiders attacked, we had only minutes. They came from the South Ridge. I didn't see their faces, only their torches." "You did what you had to," Mason said. "I left everything," she murmured. "Everything I owned. Everything I knew." Mason didn't tell her it wasn't her fault or offer empty comfort. He knew those words never landed right. Instead, he fed another piece of wood into the fire, giving her the steady warmth she needed. "You'll get through this," he said simply. Asha didn't look at him, but she nodded. Her breathing steadied as the fire grew stronger, the heat easing her shivers. For the first time since they met, her shoulders relaxed completely, dropping from the tension she had held since emerging from behind the waterfall. Mason leaned back against the wall near the door, settling into a position that allowed him to rest without lowering his guard. He watched the flames reflect faintly in Asha's eyes as she finally let her gaze soften. For the moment, danger was far away. She wasn't running. He wasn't alone. Neither of them said it aloud, but the shift between them was clear. They had stepped into each other's lives without intention, yet neither pulled away. The fire crackled on, warming the small room as the sun disappeared entirely behind the canyon walls. Asha slowly lay on her side, keeping the coat close, trusting the shelter for the first time since entering it. Mason stayed awake a little longer, listening to the land, keeping watch, not because she asked him to, but because the decision felt right. Night settled fully over the canyon by the time the fire stabilized into a steady glow, casting shifting lines of amber across the rough walls. Asha had stopped shivering, her body slowly adjusting to the warmth circulating through the small room. Mason could tell she was exhausted. Her eyelids lowered, then lifted again each time a distant sound reached her. Even half asleep, she remained alert, proof of how long she had been surviving alone. Mason sat near the entrance, one knee raised, his back braced against the log frame. His posture looked relaxed, but it was anything but. Every few minutes he tilted his head slightly, listening for movement outside. Loose rocks shifting, brush being disturbed, hoofbeats, anything that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the canyon. Years of scouting had sharpened his senses, and even after leaving that life behind, he could not force himself to ignore threats. Asha shifted on the stone ledge, pulling the coat closer to her neck. "Do you stay awake this late, every night?" she asked quietly. Her voice was soft, roughened by fatigue. "Most nights," Mason answered. Hard to break the habit. She studied him in the firelight, noticing the lines near his eyes, the set of his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his belt even while resting. He wasn't tense in a panicked way. He carried tension the way some men carried tools. Always there, ready for use, part of him. "You don't trust the dark," she said. He considered that. "I trusted to hide things that should be seen." Asha kept her gaze on him for several seconds. She was trying to understand something she hadn't asked yet. What exactly he had lived through to make him this vigilant. "I used to sleep easily," she said, "before the raids started coming closer to our camps. After that, every noise sounded like danger." "You're safe right now," Mason said, not as a promise, but as an observation. "No tracks near the entrance. No fresh sign. Nothing following us." She nodded, appreciating the certainty in his tone rather than doubting it. "Do you think the raiders will keep searching?" "They scatter once they lose sight of their target," he answered. "They don't waste time doubling back unless they have a reason." "What reason would they need?" Mason met her eyes. "Value." Asha understood immediately. The raiders didn't pursue people out of anger. They pursued anything they could trade, capture, or use. "I have nothing they want," she said, though her voice was tight, revealing the fear she tried to mask. "You made it away," Mason replied. "That's enough for them to move on." Silence followed, heavy but not hostile. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying sand across the entrance in small, scraping waves. Asha eased on her back, testing how much her ankle would tolerate the movement. Pain flashed briefly across her face before she steadied herself again. Mason noticed the strain. "You should raise your foot a little," he suggested, nodding toward a flat stone near her. "Takes pressure off." She adjusted carefully, placing the stone under her heel. The relief came slowly but noticeably. "Thank you," she murmured. He returned his attention to the entrance, eyes scanning the faint moonlight bleeding through the cracks. The mare stood tied just outside, calm but alert. He could hear her occasional snort. Horses sensed danger quicker than most men, and her quiet confidence gave him one more reason to believe they were secure for the night. Asha shifted again, this time propping herself on her elbow. "You said earlier you left places behind. What kind of places?" Mason didn't answer right away. Speaking about his past always stirred things he preferred to leave buried. But her question wasn't prying. It came from someone trying to understand the man who had stepped into danger to help her. "Fort camps," he said finally. "Scouting routes. That life breaks a person down if they stay too long." "Why did you stay as long as you did?" she asked. "Duty," he replied, "or what I thought was duty." He paused before adding, "When a call goes wrong, it follows you. You don't forget the faces." Her eyes softened. "You carry it with you." "Every day," he said, voice low but steady. Asha lowered herself again, drawing the coat over her shoulders. She didn't offer comfort. She knew better than to pretend words could wash away guilt. Instead, she gave him something else, understanding without intrusion. "You helped me today," she said quietly. That counts for something. Mason didn't acknowledge the statement aloud, but she saw a faint shift in his posture, a small release in the rigid line of his shoulders. The fire popped once, sending a small ember drifting upward before it faded. Asha's breathing gradually slowed into a rhythm that suggested she was finally drifting towards sleep. Her hand rested near the coat's edge, fingers lightly curled in a way that showed she still didn't fully trust the world around her, but she trusted it more than she had hours ago. Mason stayed awake, his eyes half open, listening to the canyon as if the land itself could warn him. He didn't resent the responsibility. Protecting someone gave purpose to a man who had spent too long drifting with no reason to care where he ended up. Near midnight, Asha stirred, her voice soft and unguarded. "You'll wake me if something happens?" "You'll know before I do," Mason said. Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. Then she let her eyes close again, her breathing evening out as sleep finally claimed her without resistance. Mason watched over her as the fire dimmed, his presence steady and unmoving. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone in the dark, and it didn't feel like a burden. A faint gray light crept into the shelter long before the sun cleared the canyon ridge. Mason was already awake, sitting against the entrance frame with his arms resting loosely over his knees. He hadn't slept, but he didn't look drained. Men who had spent years on patrol learned to rest without closing their eyes. The mare outside let out a quiet breath, signaling that dawn was near. Asha stirred on the stone ledge, her fingers tightening briefly around the coat before she remembered where she was. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for several seconds she stayed still, assessing the dim room, listening for danger, grounding herself in the warmth of the dying fire. When she finally sat up, her expression showed momentary confusion. Then recognition washed over her. "You stayed awake all night," she said, her voice rough from sleep. "I rested enough," Mason replied. "Didn't want anything catching us off guard." Asha studied him in the soft morning light filtering through the roof. His posture was controlled, but his face held a different kind of tiredness, a mental weariness, not physical. She wondered how many nights he had spent like this before their paths crossed. "You didn't have to watch alone," she said. "I know," he answered, "but you needed to sleep more than I did." Outside, a low gust of wind brushed sand across the doorway. Mason rose, stretching his stiff shoulders. The sun hadn't reached them yet, but the air was warmer than the night had been. Asha tested her ankle, placing her foot on the ground carefully. The ache was sharp at first, but not as unbearable as the day before. She exhaled through her nose, relieved she could put weight on it. Mason noticed the way she adjusted her stance. "Still sore?" "Less than last night," she said. "I can walk." "You shouldn't push it too hard," he reminded her. She gave a small shrug. "We don't have the luxury to stay here long." Mason knew she was right. Raids rarely stayed confined to one area. If the group that chased her shifted their search pattern, they could pass near this canyon without warning. He crouched near the fire pit, breaking apart the remaining embers until they could be safely covered with dirt. Asha watched him work, noting how cautious he was with even the smallest tasks. He didn't leave traces, didn't scatter ash, didn't discard anything carelessly. He behaved like a man trained to disappear when needed. "Where will you go after this?" she asked. "North," he said. "I still have 2 horses to deliver." "And after that?" He paused before answering. "Depends on where the road leads." His vague response didn't surprise her. Mason wasn't someone who planned far ahead. He moved from place to place like he was trying to outrun something that didn't move at all. Asha stood finally, pulling the coat around her. She rubbed warmth into her arms, still feeling the chill from yesterday's water. "I'll need clothes before we travel far. We'll look around the canyon," Mason said. "Sometimes hunters leave scraps behind. Could be enough for you to make something." Her brows lifted slightly. "You know how to find things most people overlook." "Comes from years of walking alone," he said. Asha stepped toward the entrance, pausing beside him. She scanned the landscape with the same caution he had shown the night before. The canyon looked empty, but emptiness never guaranteed safety. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. Many men would have kept riding. He met her gaze steadily. Because you needed someone to stop. Her throat tightened at the simplicity of his answer. She wasn't used to kindness without expectation. It unsettled her, but not in a dangerous way. More like a feeling she didn't know how to carry. Mason stepped outside first, making sure the ground was clear before motioning for her to follow. The mare flicked her tail as they approached, sensing movement but showing no agitation. Asha walked slowly, mindful of her ankle. She reached out to touch the mare's neck, her fingers brushing the warm coat gently. The mare responded with a soft snort. "She likes you," Mason said. Asha almost smiled. "She's calmer than most people." Mason tightened the saddle straps while Asha scanned the canyon walls. In daylight, the path ahead looked different, less threatening, more defined. She felt a cautious hope, but she didn't want to cling to it too quickly. "We'll search upstream first," Mason said as he secured the reins. Hunters usually work close to water. Asha nodded. "Lead the way. I'll keep pace." They moved together through the canyon, their steps falling into an unspoken rhythm. Asha no longer checked behind her as often. Mason noticed this change and didn't comment, but it settled something inside him, something small but undeniably present. They found the remnants of an old camp near a cluster of boulders, a broken frame used for tanning hides, a few discarded scraps, and a length of cord stiffened by age. Asha crouched beside the materials, her eyes scanning them with trained skill. "I can work with this," she said. "I've made clothing from worse." Mason watched her tie knots with quiet efficiency, her fingers moving with a familiarity that revealed how resourceful she had become during months of isolation. "You've lived on your own for a while," he observed. "Too long," she admitted. "Surviving is not the same as living." He hadn't expected her to say something so direct. It hit deeper than he let on. Asha lifted her head, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "And you? Have you been living?" Mason closed his bag slowly, thinking. "I've been moving," he said. "Whether that counts as living, I'm not sure." Asha held his eyes for a moment, then nodded as if she understood something about him he hadn't said aloud. "We'll keep going," she said. "Both of us." Mason felt the truth in her words more than the meaning. As they returned to the shelter's doorway to gather the last of their things, a different kind of quiet settled between them. Not fearful, not uncertain, but strangely steady. They weren't alone anymore, and for the first time in a long while, neither one of them resisted that fact. By late morning, the sun reached high enough to warm the canyon walls, casting long, sharp shadows across the dry ground. Asha spread the scraps of hide they had collected across a flat stone outside the shelter. The pieces were worn and uneven, but she examined each one with a focused expression, planning how to turn them into something she could wear. Her fingers moved with steady precision, testing the thickness and deciding which parts could be shaped into panels. Mason stood a short distance away, repairing one of the loose beams above the shelter's entrance. He used a small hatchet to trim the cracked ends, working in careful, controlled motions. The thud of wood echoed lightly in the air, a background sound that felt strangely reassuring to Asha. For months, she had relied only on her own movements and breaths. Now another person's presence filled the space around her without threatening it. "You've done this sort of work before?" she asked, glancing up at him. "Ranch jobs," he said. "You learn to fix things if you want them to last." She threaded a strip of hide through a small hole she had cut, pulling it through with practiced ease. "I learned to sew because no one else wanted to," she said. "Then everyone expected it from me." "You don't seem to mind the task," he observed. "What I mind is having no choice," she replied. "But today I'm choosing, so it feels different." Mason absorbed that quietly, appreciating the clarity of her words. By late morning, the sun reached high enough to warm the canyon walls, casting long, sharp shadows across the dry ground. Asha spread the scraps of hide they had collected across a flat stone outside the shelter. The pieces were worn and uneven, but she examined each one with a focused expression, planning how to turn them into something she could wear. Her fingers moved with steady precision, testing the thickness and deciding which parts could be shaped into panels. Mason stood a short distance away, repairing one of the loose beams above the shelter's entrance. He used a small hatchet to trim the cracked ends, working in careful, controlled motions. He moved to check the next weak part of the roof. Asha watched him for a moment, noticing how he avoided standing directly behind her or making sudden movements. He hovered at the edge of her awareness, steady but non-intrusive, and that consideration created a sense of safety she hadn't felt in a long time. When she returned to her work, she winced slightly as her ankle throbbed. Mason caught the motion immediately. "You need to sit for a bit," he said. "Walking on it all morning isn't helping." "I'm fine," she argued gently, though she already lowered herself to the ground. Her pride always flared first, but she wasn't stubborn enough to ignore pain. Mason set aside his tools and walked toward her. He didn't ask to inspect her ankle again. He only crouched beside her with enough space that she didn't feel crowded. "You're pushing yourself because you want to be useful," he said. "But resting doesn't make you a burden." Asha held his gaze, reading the sincerity in his expression. It wasn't pity, it was practical concern. "I'm not used to someone noticing when I'm struggling," she admitted. "That doesn't mean you shouldn't be seen," he replied. She drew in a slow breath, letting the words settle. After a few minutes of quiet, she resumed measuring the scraps with newly paced movements. Mason returned to reinforcing the shelter, securing loose sections with branches he had trimmed earlier. The day unfolded with the kind of rhythm that felt natural rather than forced. Shared tasks, occasional conversation, long stretches of silence that didn't strain either of them. As Asha shaped the outlines of the dress, she found herself watching Mason's hands. They were strong but moved with an attentiveness that surprised her. Most men she had encountered forced their way through tasks, but Mason handled each piece of wood with deliberate care, as if rushing risked breaking something important. "You treat things gently," she said. Mason paused mid-swing. "Not always, but I'm trying." She nodded, appreciating that he didn't pretend to be perfect. When the midday heat intensified, Mason fetched a water skin from the mare and brought it to her. Asha accepted it without hesitation. Hours earlier, she might have flinched from such closeness. Now she drank and handed it back with calm steadiness. "You're getting color back," he said, noticing the warmth in her face. "Feeling more like myself," she answered. "Good. Means you're healing." Asha resumed sewing, her fingers threading strips of hide with small, even motions. "Healing doesn't only happen in the body," she said quietly. "Sometimes it starts when someone treats you like you matter." Mason looked at her directly for the first time in several minutes. His eyes held a quiet understanding, an acknowledgement that neither of them had been treated gently by life for a long time. "You matter," he said plainly, without reaching for sentiment. Asha didn't look away. She absorbed the statement in full, and something in her posture softened again, just slightly. By mid-afternoon, the rough shape of her new dress had formed. It wasn't elegant, but it was sturdy and covered her well. She stood to test the fit, steadying herself with one hand on the canyon wall. Mason looked over briefly, making sure she was comfortable but not staring. "It fits," she said. "Not perfect, but it will do." "It's good work," Mason replied. She allowed herself a small smile. "Thank you for finding the materials. Thank you for making something out of them," he said. Their exchange felt simple, yet something meaningful passed between them, a recognition that they were functioning as a team. As the sun dipped toward the canyon's western ridge, the air cooled slightly. Mason gathered the tools he had used throughout the day, while Asha folded the remaining scraps for future repairs. "Tomorrow we should move," he said. This shelter served its purpose, but staying risks drawing attention. Asha nodded. Her expression held both fear and resolve. "I trust your judgment." Mason strapped his gear to the mare, glancing back at Asha as she tightened the belt of her new dress. She looked stronger than she had the day before, more grounded, more sure of herself. "We'll leave at dawn," he said. "I'll be ready," she replied. They stood together outside the shelter as the last light faded, neither rushing the moment. It was the first day they had worked side by side, and both felt the shift. It was no longer two strangers forced together by circumstance. It was the beginning of something steady they hadn't expected. The evening settled with a heavier quiet than the night before, the kind that came when two people finally had enough breath left to think instead of simply react. The sun dropped behind the far ridge, leaving the canyon washed in fading gold before the shadows overtook it. Asha and Mason gathered what little they had prepared for the journey. Mason's supplies, the repaired saddle gear, and the scraps Asha planned to turn into small pouches later on. Asha adjusted the fit of her new dress again, smoothing the seam she had tied with hide strips. It wasn't comfortable yet, but it held together well enough for travel. She stepped outside the shelter to stretch her ankle, letting the cooling air ease the lingering ache. Mason set down a small pot beside the fire pit and poured in the last of their clean water, planning a simple broth from dried herbs he carried for long trips. "You're moving better," he observed. "Still sore," she replied, "but I can keep pace." "You don't have to push harder than necessary tomorrow," Mason said. Asha glanced at him with a faint tilt of her head. "You worry a lot." Mason tied the pot handle with a strip of cloth, preventing it from tipping. "I've lost enough people to be cautious." Asha lowered herself onto a rock near the fire, her knees pulled slightly inward. "People close to you?" "People I served with," he answered. "Some I rode with for years. Others I barely knew. Losing them feels the same." She listened, noting the heaviness in his tone. He didn't avoid the topic, but he didn't welcome it either. He spoke like a man who had spent a long time trying to carry the past without letting it crush him. "What made you leave that life?" she asked. Mason poked the firewood with a stick, pushing the embers into a small mound. "A decision that shouldn't have been mine. I took a risk to protect a group of settlers, and the timing was wrong. They paid for it." Asha exhaled slowly. "You blame yourself even now." "Every day," he said, "but blaming doesn't undo anything." She studied him, seeing the internal battle he carried. "You helped me without hesitating," she said. "A man who doesn't care wouldn't have stopped." "That doesn't erase the past," he replied. "No," Asha agreed softly, "but it shows the kind of person you still are." Mason didn't respond, but his eyes shifted toward her, and something in his expression softened just slightly. The broth simmered slowly, and Mason ladled a small portion into a tin cup for Asha. She accepted it with both hands, breathing in the steam before tasting it. It was simple, earthy, but warm enough to calm her empty stomach. "This is better than anything I've eaten in weeks," she said. "You must have been running a long time," he said. "Long enough to forget what a calm night feels like," she replied. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the fire casting steady light on the ground around them. Asha felt her muscles relax, not because she was fully safe, but because she wasn't alone in facing the next dawn. Mason remained near her, close enough to be reassuring, but far enough that she didn't feel trapped. His awareness of boundaries surprised her more each hour. As the meal finished, she set the cup down and watched the flames. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. Mason shifted his attention to her. "Go ahead." "When the raiders hit my camp, they weren't searching at random. They were following a track. Someone told them which path our group was taking." "You're certain?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "They knew exactly where to strike. They came straight for the women's tents." Mason's jaw tightened, which means they might not be scattered. They could be moving through these canyons again. "That's why I don't want to slow us down tomorrow," she said. "If they find the trail we used." "They won't," he said firmly. "We're leaving early. I'll make sure we stay ahead." Asha held his gaze. She trusted the certainty in his voice, not because he was trying to reassure her, but because he stated facts like someone who knew the land and its dangers with precision. She shifted slightly closer to the fire, letting the heat warm her legs. The sky was now fully dark, dotted with distant stars that appeared between narrow slices of canyon wall. The wind grew colder, prompting her to pull the coat around her shoulders again. Mason stood, stretched his back, and carried a few more branches to the fire. When he placed them down, Asha reached out instinctively, touching his wrist before she realized she had done it. Her fingers barely grazed his skin, but the contact surprised them both. She pulled her hand back, not embarrassed, just cautious. "I didn't mean—" "It's fine," Mason said gently. He didn't move away. Asha studied his face for a moment. The firelight revealed the faint weariness carved into the lines around his eyes, yet his posture stayed calm. He wasn't uncomfortable with her closeness, just careful. "I'm not used to being near anyone," Asha admitted. "Neither am I," he said. "But we'll figure it out." She felt tension she didn't know she was holding begin to ease. Not all at once, but in small increments that made her shoulders finally lower. Mason returned to his place near the door once the fire steadied. Asha settled on the ledge inside the shelter, letting the warmth soothe her aching feet. The night air drifted in quietly, carrying the distant call of an owl. "Will you sleep at all?" she asked him before lying down. "Eventually," he answered. "I'll rest once the canyon settles." Asha nodded. She closed her eyes slowly, trusting the silence between them more than she trusted the land. Her breathing even out, steady and controlled. Mason listened to it, recognizing a pattern that meant she wasn't fighting sleep anymore. He glanced at her one last time before turning his attention to the dark canyon beyond the doorway. Tomorrow would bring unknowns. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel threatening to either of them. Dawn broke slowly over the ridge, spilling thin light into the canyon like a curtain being lifted. The air held a crisp chill, sharper than the previous morning, and Asha woke to the faint scrape of Mason's boots as he stepped outside to check the terrain. Her body felt rested for the first time in many nights. The ache in her ankle dulled to a manageable throb. She sat up, rubbing her eyes and letting the cool air settle over her skin. Mason returned a moment later, brushing dust from his gloves. "Tracks are old," he said. "Nothing fresh. We should move before the sun climbs higher." Asha stood carefully and tested her weight on her foot. It held, not without discomfort, but strong enough for steady walking. She tightened the belt around her high dress and stepped outside, letting the early light warm her shoulders. "I'm ready," she said. Mason nodded, adjusting the cinch strap on the mare. "I'll leave for the first stretch. The path is narrow in places, so keep close." She positioned herself just behind him. She didn't cling to his presence, but she stayed near enough that he could hear her steps. It wasn't fear anymore, just a practical need for safety in unfamiliar terrain. They walked along the canyon floor, the walls rising sharply on either side. Mason kept his pace slow, guiding the mare over loose stones and dry patches. Asha matched his stride without complaint, her focus fixed on the winding path ahead. The coat remained tied around her waist now that the sun was warming the air. After several minutes, she spoke quietly. "If I had been alone today, I might not have left the shelter." "You're not alone," Mason said, not turning his head. "Not while you're with me." She absorbed the statement silently. He didn't say it as a vow or a grand promise. It was simply the truth he intended to uphold. When they reached the first ridge, the land opened into a wide stretch of brush and scattered rock. Asha paused at the crest, her eyes sweeping over the landscape. The wilderness stretched far in every direction, a reminder of how vulnerable she had been the past few days. Mason studied the horizon beside her. "We'll follow that line of trees. There's a stream past the bend. Fresh water will help us at midday." Asha nodded, appreciating how he explained each decision rather than expecting her to follow blindly. They moved down the slope, the mare stepping carefully behind them. Asha watched Mason's movements, how he scanned the land constantly, how he checked shadows without appearing nervous, how he slowed whenever the terrain shifted. Everything he did was intentional. "You know this area well?" she asked. "Traveled through it every season for the last 5 years," he said. "Sold horses to a ranch north of here. Learned the safe paths the hard way." "What happened on the unsafe ones?" she asked, not accusing, just curious. "Lost a good man to a flash flood," he said quietly. "Lost another to an ambush. Since then, I plan my routes more carefully." Asha didn't respond right away. She considered his words, understanding them not as a story, but as a pattern of survival. "You carry a lot," she said finally. "So do you," he replied. The trail narrowed again between 2 stone outcrops. Asha stepped closer, and at one point her hand brushed his arm as she steadied herself. Mason didn't react abruptly. He simply glanced back to make sure she wasn't hurt. "You all right?" he asked. Yes, she answered. Just a loose rock. She didn't pull away with embarrassment this time. Instead, she kept her place beside him as the canyon opened toward a sunlit plain. By late morning, they reached a patch of tall grass. A stream shimmered softly through the center, its slow current reflecting the bright sky. Mason let the mare drink while he refilled their water skin. Asha knelt nearby, washing dust from her hands and face. The water was cool enough to ease the lingering heat from their walk. Mason watched her briefly, noticing the steadiness returning to her features. The tension she carried yesterday had eased into a quiet determination. She was still guarded, but she wasn't shrinking from the world anymore. We'll make better time on the open plain, he said. Less climbing. Asha stood, wiping her hands on the edge of her dress. Where will we go after that? I was heading north to finish a delivery, he said. But the road can be changed. She studied him closely. Are you saying that for my sake or for your own? Mason took a moment before answering. For both. Asha's expression shifted, soft, cautious, and thoughtful. I don't want to hold you from your work. You're not, he said. I'm choosing to walk with you. That's different. The honesty in his statement held a weight she didn't expect. She had spent months believing no one would ever willingly stay near her unless forced. Hearing that he chose this path made something settle inside her, something she had been fighting to protect. Asha stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. She rested her hand lightly on his forearm, her fingers barely curling over the fabric of his sleeve. This time she didn't draw back. Mason didn't move either. He stayed still, letting her set the tone. Then we go north together, she said quietly. If that's what you want, Mason replied. It is. They resumed, walking along the stream, their steps falling into a comfortable rhythm. The plain stretched ahead, wide and open, yet neither felt exposed. The sense of partnership between them had grown into something unspoken but firm. For the first time since they met, the path didn't feel temporary. They were no longer two separate lives crossing by accident. They were choosing the same direction, willingly, without fear or hesitation. And neither of them looked back. By late afternoon, the open plain gave way to a gentle rise covered in scattered juniper trees. The sky had shifted into a softer shade of blue, stretched wide above them without a single cloud. The land here felt calmer, less harsh, less unpredictable, and Asha slowed as she took in the view. Something about the quietness drew her forward. Her shoulders lowered and the tightness in her breath eased. Mason guided the mare up the slope, stopping at the crest. From there, a small valley revealed itself, sheltered on three sides and open only to the east. A stream wound through the center, curving gently around a patch of flat ground large enough for a home, a corral, and anything else two people might build over time. It was far from any known settlement, yet not so remote that survival would be impossible. Asha stepped ahead of him, her eyes fixed on the valley. It's peaceful, she said. It's forgotten land, Mason replied. Most riders pass it without noticing. Do you think it's safe? She asked. As safe as anywhere can be, he said, and easier to defend than open canyon trails. Asha walked down the slope, moving slowly to avoid straining her ankle. When she reached the stream, she crouched to trail her fingers through the water. It was cool and clean. She splashed some onto her face, letting the droplets run over her skin, and, as she did, Mason saw something he hadn't seen since they met. Relief. Real, visible relief. She stood again, brushing her wet hands over her dress. I could live here, she said softly, if that's something we're considering. Mason approached with measured steps. I wasn't planning on settling anywhere, he admitted, but plans don't have to stay fixed. Asha turned to him fully, the coat tied at her waist, her dark hair drying unevenly in the warm breeze. She looked stronger than she had at the waterfall, still guarded, but no longer ready to flee at the slightest noise. Yesterday, I was running for my life, she said. Today I'm standing in a place that feels like it belongs to someone who survived. You survived, Mason said. So did you, she replied, even if you don't call it that. He lowered his gaze briefly, acknowledging the truth in her words. He hadn't thought of himself as surviving anything, only enduring it. But her presence had changed the weight of his thoughts, softened the edges of the regret he carried. Asha stepped closer. You helped me when you could have turned away. I don't forget that. You gave me something too, Mason said quietly. A reason to stop moving. She held his eyes, searching for hesitation and finding none. Slowly, she reached out and placed her hand on his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. Her touch was gentle but confident. Mason didn't move at first. He let her choose how close she wanted to stand. When she didn't pull away, he lifted his hand and rested it lightly on her back, careful not to startle her. You're not alone anymore, she said. And neither are you, he answered. They stood together by the stream, not rushing the moment. The silence that settled around them wasn't the guarded quiet of their first day. It was a calm shaped by mutual choice. After a long pause, Asha looked toward the flat patch of ground near the trees. If we cleared those stones, we could build a small shelter, she said. Stronger than the hunter's one. We can start as soon as you want, Mason replied. Today, she said. I want today. Mason nodded. Then today it is. He led the mare to the shade of a juniper tree, while Asha began gathering smaller stones to mark the foundation line. Her pace was slow at first due to her ankle, but she worked steadily, her movements purposeful. Mason joined her, lifting the larger stones and setting them aside. Their tasks aligned seamlessly. No instructions needed, no confusion, only quiet cooperation. As they worked, light shifted across the valley floor, turning the grass a deeper gold. Mason straightened his back and watched Asha as she adjusted a row of stones. There was a calm strength in her posture, a certainty that hadn't been there the day before. You're sure about staying here? He asked. Yes, she said without looking up. Are you? He stepped closer until she faced him again. I am. Asha's breath caught for a moment, not from fear but from something unfamiliar, stability. Mason reached out slowly, letting her see his hand before he touched her. When she didn't step back, he rested his palm along her cheek. Her eyes softened, and she leaned into the contact with a quiet acceptance that held more meaning than any words. She moved closer, closing the small gap between them. Then this is our beginning, she said. Mason lowered his forehead to hers, steady and deliberate. Ours, he agreed. They stood like that for several seconds, grounded by everything they had endured and everything they were willing to build together. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, they returned to their work, shaping the land one stone at a time. The valley felt different now. Not just a hiding place or a passage between dangers, but a home being created deliberately, with intention and hope. For the first time in years, Mason saw a future that wasn't defined by running. And for the first time since the raid separated her from her people, Asha felt anchored to something she chose rather than something she escaped. Their day ended with the foundation of a shelter half laid out, the mare grazing nearby, and a fire beginning to crackle under the open sky. They had found safety, belonging, and each other, no doubts remaining, no loose ends left behind. The new life they would build was theirs, chosen freely. And it began here, together,